Now, while the investigation plays out here, there are some real here and now consequences potentially in the political landscape. Now, without a doubt, the events over the past week could really impact two of the big issues getting play in D.C. this week. And I want to bring Andrew back for that. And Andrew, immigration, let's start there.
Well, and this was going to be a big deal in Washington this week, even before the bombings in Washington. And that debate over immigration reform got started today, covering both the plight of undocumented workers already in the U.S. and Border and Customs efforts to try and stop the flow of undocumented immigrants. But then came Boston. And even as early as last week, lawmakers were using the attack as a reason to be cautious and advocate for going slow on immigration reform.
Given the events of this week, it's important for us to understand the gaps and loopholes in our immigration system. How can we beef up security checks on people who wish to enter the United States? How do we ensure that people who wish to do us harm are not eligible for benefits under the immigration laws, including this new bill before us?
Then today at a Senate hearing on immigration reform, the Boston bombings came up again, and it's the same Chuck Grassley who jumps on Chuck Schumer at the hearing.
So if you have ways to improve the bill, offer an amendment when we start markup in May and let's vote on it. I say that particularly those who are pointing to what happened, the terrible tragedy in Boston, as I would say, excuse for not doing a bill or delaying it many months or years.
I never said that.
I didn't say you did.
Never said that.
I didn't say you did, sir.
I didn't say anything
I didn't say
about
you did.
delaying
I
the
don't
bill.
mean you, Mr. Grassley.
Mr. Chairman.
So clearly Boston on the minds of the immigration debate going forward as people look for ways to be as secure as possible and figuring out who comes in and
Richard,
who doesn't.
You realize the political challenges, especially for Republicans on this issue. They saw obviously the exit polls came out in November here. They know how bad they lost the Latino vote and how much the issue of immigration hurt them in November. Yet you can hear from Senator Grassley and others, read between the lines here, they want to go slow. They don't want to go as far as maybe even some of the Rubios in your party want to. How much do you think this past week may play into this conversation?
I definitely think it plays somewhat. I mean, you've got to pay attention to it. I think even Mark Rubio said, he was quoted in the paper as saying, if there is a loophole that we missed in this immigration bill that would have stopped Boston, then let's find out what it is. But at the end of the day, the immigration reform needs to be passed. It needs to happen. How quickly it will take place, I don't know, but I think it's certainly worth, as Dominic said, remember the lives that were lost. Certainly worth looking at this immigration bill to see if there was any loopholes that would have stopped Boston.
And we're clear, though. I think this is a question that's asked and answered. These guys came through the proper way. They applied. One, in fact, got citizenship after going through. The other one was denied. I don't think there's any, how did these guys get in the country, assumed aliases or anything else. These two brothers, I think, bad case makes bad law. This is not the argument people want to do a holdup on immigration.
Well, they got into the country legally. I mean, as legal refugees through that process.
Well, they got in on other visas, and then they applied for refugee status once they were
political
here.
asylum, I understand, too.
And that was the grounds for it.
And keep in mind, there are a lot of people in Washington who want to go slow on immigration anyway, and certainly nobody's going to go to bat for, the two people suspected behind the bombings in Boston. So you're looking at it. I would just advise caution that it's easy to score political points, especially right now, using that as an example to try to slow the process down.
Okay, now this next one is predicated on a hypothetical, and I want to be clear to the audience here. We have no evidence as we sit here tonight that the guns in question here, Andrew, had how they were obtained, but we do know this much. There's no legal record of these guys having any legal rights to actually purchase these guns, so we know they weren't acquired through the proper channels.
Well, that we do know, Rich, and while there are still questions about how exactly those weapons were acquired, there are some connections to other issues that have been in the gun debate. Of course, last week the Senate voting down the compromise on beefed up background checks despite 90% approval from voters. But you have to wonder if that issue might be revisited in Washington. There are no plans to do it right now, given what we heard and saw in Watertown, Massachusetts Thursday night. Residents in Watertown subjected to what sounded and surely felt like a cross between a gun range and a war scene. Maybe lawmakers will be motivated by what we've learned about that shootout, that the Tsarnaev brothers, in addition to carrying 6 bombs, also had handguns on them. We don't yet know how many. They had a rifle and 250 plus rounds of ammunition on them as they engaged police. We also know from Cambridge PD that the younger brother was too young to have a Massachusetts firearm license. You need one if you're going to buy a gun in Massachusetts. And the older brother didn't have a license and never applied for one, meaning one way or another, the guns they had on them were illegally obtained. We know that. And as for background checks, the Times and the Huffington Post reporting that a background check helped lead to the denial of Tamarin Tsarnaev's application for citizenship. So you have to wonder, if it stopped him from becoming an American citizen, Rich, would it also have prevented him from acquiring a gun if he had gone through the legal process of trying to do that?
Let's say hypothetically we learn, we know these guys obtain guns illegally. Let's say, and again I stress this is a hypothetical here, they acquired a gun through a gun show where there's no background checks, or they bought these guns online right now with loopholes big enough to drive this table through, or they even had assault weapons, okay, because we don't know yet exactly what type of guns were by make and model. Does that change at all the conversation going on in Washington, Tom?
Absolutely not. And the reason being, I wish it would, and it should, and I'm sure Richard will tell us why, but what we would hear from the NRA is the only thing that stops a terrorist with a gun is another man with a gun. That probably would be the line from Wayne LaPierre.
If there is reason to do background checks and to call the Russians, fair enough. If there's reason to do background checks when the guy wants to be a citizen, fair enough. What's the rational distinction between that and a background check on someone who wants to buy a submachine gun?
If they got guns, let's say at a gun show, and we said, my God, if they just checked these guys, they never would have walked out. That wouldn't change and put pressure on lawmakers, Richard?
No, that's absolutely.
Really?
Listen,
Not at all.
What more do you need? I mean,
the goal, immigration reform. Look, first of all, let's back up. Why, if he was rejected to be a U.S. citizen, was he still in this country? I mean, that question needs to be answered.
There are plenty of non-citizens who are in this country.
Well, then why?
Because he had a green card.
Okay, and when was he going to be able to apply to be an American? I mean,
Permanent resident status is available to non-citizens.
but to be fair, come back to the gun thing for a second.
Sure.
If he got a gun, we know he got a gun illegally. If he got it through some of the loopholes that we always talk about here, right? Why wouldn't that be like all of America hates terrorists and 90% of Americans want background checks? What more do we need here to say, time out? This is not in the nation's best interest. This is against public safety here that these two creeps could get their hands on guns this way.
I think the real answer is right in your question, whereas 90% of Americans want universal background checks, but 90% of Montanans don't. Whereas you had Democratic Max Buckus who vote against background
You're
checks.
not really
now,
blaming this on the Democrats, are you?
There
You
were
were
4
doing
Democrats
so
who
well.
vote. There were
And how
4
many Republicans?
Doesn't
50?
matter. You could have more Democrats. Look, they're voting their constituency. That's the important part, whether they be Republican or Democrats. Okay.
We've already heard from some quarters. We played some of the audio from Watertown from Thursday night. We've already heard plenty of people say, if you lived in Watertown, Massachusetts, if that was happening outside your window, wouldn't you want a gun in your house to protect yourself? Yeah. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying I agree with it. That's the argument, and that's why, while this might change the discussion, it doesn't change the result.
I still think, and I've been wrong about 500 times, as Dominic will remind me on this point, if we find out here that they got their guns through a way that could have been shut down clearly with a loophole, with a background check, I just think maybe, just maybe, some opinions might change just a little bit. All right, we've got to take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk about Richard Brodsky's favorite whipping boy, that being the media, and its role throughout the bombing's coverage here. When old and new media collide, who wins or does everybody lose? We'll be right back.